Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Peah chapter 3, Halacha 3, and we're going to get into growing onions and debates on onions, but keep in mind, this is really to help sharpen our mind to think about halachic things in a deeper, richer way. There's a lot of halachic points. It's a short halacha, but there's a lot of fine points and gray areas, and you'll see how the sages navigate it. So, in getting into onions, we talked about it yesterday in Halacha 2, and in Halacha 3, it's even more about onions. And I went ahead and looked up a lot about growing onions, so you don't have to. So, it turns out that there are 4 ways to plant onions. Some of the terminology is a little bit different in the modern way of gardening than what the Talmud is expressing. So yesterday I called mother onions that they were already sprouted and they were being planted to split off and to create more plants. The Talmud doesn't use that term that way. Mother onions in the Talmudic term are going to be where they're used and grown just to get the seed, and they sprout, and that's it. It's the bulb is only just used to get the seed. So we have one type is going to be growing onions from seeds. The second type of growing onions, where if you take a look at scallions and green onions, they're basically sprouts. So people will plant that, and then the bulb will get larger and larger, and they're frequently sold that way and planted that way. Another way they're planted is where they're very, very small onions that are fully bulbed. There's no green part on the top. These are called onion sets, and these are from the last year's harvest. From the last year's harvest, you have these little tiny onions, and they're saved, and then they're put into the ground, and they will grow the green part for the top, and they will widen and get bigger and bigger, and that's another type. And then you have another type where they're planting something that's already sprouted from last year. So perhaps they have it in storage, it's already starting to sprout, and they'll plant those, and what will happen is over time, those will split up into new onions so that when they harvest them, they'll be getting a number of bulbs out of it. Think of that one like potatoes, because when you plant one potato, it'll grow in a way where it splits up underground and grows lots of new tubers underground, and there'll be, in the end, you might have one potato creating 5 or 6 new potatoes in that way. And the same thing with these sprouted onions, where they'll plant them, and you might plant them in with some of your sets or something like that, and then when you go for your final harvest, these will split up into new onions. So you might have one onion split up into 3, 4 new onions. And then the other way is what we were talking about, is with these seeds, just planting the seeds. So this is basically everything so that you don't have to go and look at gardening to understand this. This saves you a lot of time. Here's the Mishnah. Mishnah is going to continue to talk about the law of Peah and how it relates to onions, and it's going to consider whether a certain type of onion is going to be considered Peah. Now, this type of onion is going to be the one where they're using it to grow the onion seed. Now, keep in mind, these other types, when you're planting the seeds or you're planting these scallions or the onion sets, these little dried onions from the last season, or even these sprouted onions from the last season, that these are going to be harvested for food. And so these will be Peah. They're all going to be harvested together. But what happens when you're planting just an area just for the seed? Is that going to be subject to Peah or not? So the Mishnah says mother onions are subject to Peah, but Rabbi Yossi exempts them. Something about this, again, the Tanakama are and Rabbi Yossi, they're gonna interpret the meaning of mother onions, and there's gonna be a dispute about this. Okay, and it says another dispute between Rabbi Yossi and the sages that concerns the Peah requirements of onions. The Mishnah says plots of onions that are between rows of other vegetables. Rabbi Yossi says Peah must be left from each and every plot, whereas the sages say it suffices to give Peah from one plot for them all. Now keep in mind, we were looking at something like this with the trees and the grain fields. And we were talking about them being the malba, these rectangles and blocks. And the plural on that is going to be malbanot. So it's the same sort of thing. You have these fields of onions, and you're creating these malbanot where you're planting some sort of vegetable to create these blocks. And the question is going to be where you're creating these divisions where these vegetables are going to be creating, one area of onion over here and one area of onion over here with the separation of the vegetable strip. Is that going to be considered a divider? Is that going to be dividing it so that it's going to require 2 payas instead of 1? So the Mishnah again, just to repeat that, says plots of onions that are between the rows of vegetables. Rabbi Yossi says Peah must be left for each and every plot. And the sages say it suffices to give 1 Peah for them all. So here's what Rabbi Yossi's point in the Mishnah is. Rabbi Yossi is basically saying that it's really unusual to plant onions among other vegetables. And I was doing some research on onions, as you know, and apparently onions require a lot of fertilizer, and they require really rich soil in order to get it to grow right. And that if you don't fertilize the soil, it really, and continuously, by the way, as you're growing these onions, it will pull out all the nutrients from the soil as it's trying to grow the bulb, and if you don't fertilize it continuously, you end up with really bad onions, and they just don't grow well. So basically, what Rabbi Yossi is saying is that he's saying that it's not a normal way to plant vegetables because the onions are going to pull out all the nutrients from the soil, and you're going to have something that's not good as a vegetable. So that's really not a normal thing. So what he's saying is because you wouldn't normally grow a vegetable strip like that because the onions are going to pull out all the nutrients, he's basically saying that the vegetables themselves cannot be considered an integral part of the larger field of onions. So he's basically saying that that because of this, where onions would normally not be planted like this, and vegetables would not normally be planted like this, it's really he's saying that it's really going to be a separation. And because it's really a separation, he's saying, and a divider, he's saying that you have to leave Peah from each and every one of these plots. So the sages here are going to dispute that. And they're going to hold that it's not unusual to plant onions among vegetables. And he's saying that basically that the vegetables are going to be perishable, and because they're exempt from Peah, they're going to be deemed negligible in comparison with the onions, which are subject to Peah. In other words, the area that's occupied by the vegetables is going to be treated as if it were really empty space rather than a different species. And that does not constitute a division between onion plots. So yeah, if somebody left the strip fallow, then it would count as a division. And here they're saying that the vegetables which are not subject to peah, and maybe they're going to be perishable, and maybe they may not even be growing that well at all, because the onions are taking out nutrition or whatever, but that one is going to be subject to peah and one is not. And because one is going to be subject to peah and the other's not, it's negligible. That's the point of the sages, and because of that, they're saying that uh, it doesn't create a division, and that you can leave one plot for them all. The whole area. You just give one peah. So effectively, what they're saying is that the gap between the plots of onions is not going to divide them at all, and they're saying that it's not going to create the same kind of division as if they left it fallow, and that there's not this kind of interruption. The Sugya says like this. The Gemara is going to talk about this dispute as the identity of the mother onion, and Rav says it is a seed onion, and Shmuel says it is its growth. So Rav says, according to the Mara Fulda here, that these are large onions that are left in the ground to produce seeds, a process that depletes the onions and results in them becoming barely edible. And after removing the seed from the onions, the owner decided to pluck them from the ground. And the question arises whether they require peah. And since the produce for the seeds, the produce is for the seeds, that's why it's referred to as a mother onion. And Rabbi Yossi is going to be exempting the seed onions from peah because he says they are not fit to be eaten unless under pressing circumstances. It's not the normal way to eat this kind of food. It's not normal for consumption. That's what Rabbi Yossi is saying. The sages, though, are going to be saying that even this degree of edibility, being able to eat it, suffices for them to be classified as food, so they are required for peah. That's the commentary by the Mara Fulda here. And Shmuel says that it is its growth. And the way we can understand that from the Mara Fulda is like this. It says, when one harvests onions, the roots are left in the ground, and part of the onion itself is attached to the root. And from these remnants, new onions will grow. One who has many onions will not bother to reap the new growths, but one who is short of onions will harvest and store them. So, in this case, says the Rosh Cirillo, Shmuel disagrees with Rav's explanation that mother onions are seed onions, because he holds that seed onions are not really edible, and even the sages would exempt them from peah, says the Rosh Cirillo. Another way to think about that is, again, like with these onions that are already growing from the last year, and they put it into the ground. The idea is to split them off into new ones. This could be a case where perhaps they're plucking the onion and leaving the root in, and I saw a lot of pictures that people will take onion roots and grow new onions out of these onion roots, and they will also come to split and create new sets of onions. So in this way, they're coming along to say that this is not really, they're really going to come and harvest these splits at a much later date. And these split up onions are really, you're not harvesting, you're leaving in the roots to come in and create lots and lots of onions for the following year or even 2 years later. That's one way to look at what's happening with this harvest. The Gemara is going to explain why Rabbi Yossi exempts such onions from peah. In other words, you need, the Rosh Cirillo says the following reason is needed only according to Shmuel, but according to Rav, who defines mother onions as seed onions, the reason why Rabbi Yossi exempts them is that they're only barely edible. And, we have this thing here where the owner really, according to Shmuel, doesn't really have interest in these new growths, and they're really being left in there for something maybe 2 years from now, or a year and a half from now, or a year from now, because they grow in 6 month cycles and they're active for 2 years. So Rabbi Yaakov Barban said, in the name of Rabbi Chanina, Rabbi Yossi did not say they are exempt from Peah except on the account of their ownerless hefker. So he's saying that if the owner is not showing interest in the new growths and he's splitting these off and just leaving the roots, he's saying that this is kind of like a type of hefker, according to the Mara Fulda. So that explanation is going to be challenged, and Rabbi Bon Barchia says before Rabbi Mana, but the sages, in other words, the Tanakhama of the Mishnah, hold that ownerless produce is obligated in Peah, and such a position is untenable. So the Mishnah does state unequivocally elsewhere that the ownerless produce is indeed exempt from Peah. So Rabbi Mana is going to answer. He says to Rabbi Bon Barchia, the Mishnah's case is where he reacquired them. In other words, the ownerless onions. He reacquired the ownerless onions one by one. And according to the sages, this suffices to render them subject to Peah, but according to Rabbi Yossi, they remain exempt. Let's take a look at the commentary by Rabbi Kanievsky on this. He says that the Mishnah must refer to one who plucks the new growths before, because otherwise he would not be obligated in Peah, and by plucking the growths, he indicates he wants them. This person is comparable to a person of a field who declares it ownerless and then reacquires it. There's another commentary by the Rosh Cirillo, and he's going to explain the dispute a little differently. He's going to say, Rabbi Yossi holds that since people relinquish their ownership in these mother onions, they are considered a species that is exempt from Peah. As such, they are not subject to Peah even if they are reacquired. The sages, by contrast, maintain that mother onions are not a distinct species in their own right, but belong to the general category of onions, which are certainly subject to Peah. Therefore, if one reacquires them, he must leave Peah from them. So, the Gemara is going to reject this understanding of the dispute. The Baraisa teaches that the sages respond to Rabbi Yossi's ruling vis-a-vis the mother onions being exempt from Peah with the following argument. He said, although they, mother onions, are not kept by the owner when he has many onions, they are kept by him when he has a few onions. And the sages argue here that since there are some situations where people will keep mother onions, they should be subject to Peah in all cases. So the statement says the sugya of the sages implies that Rabbi Yossi has no reason to exempt mother onions except on account of the law, says the sugya, that produce requires Peah only if he plans to keep it, only if one brings it in to keep. That is that the sages are going to deem mother onions subject to Peah because sometimes they are kept, whereas Rabbi Yossi exempts them because in most cases they are not kept. So the Gemara is going to refute the explanation by Rabbi Yossi that mother onions are exempt because they are ownerless. Rather, Rabbi Yossi's reason is that such onions are not brought in for storage. So in the case we were talking about yesterday, where you're planting these onions that had already sprouted from the last year and you're planting them to create more onions, and then perhaps in 6 months or 5 months you come in to harvest, you are harvesting even the original one that you planted and the ones that split off from it as well. So those would be subject to Peah. The point here by Rabbi Yossi, and I think also the point yesterday by Rabbi Yossi, is when he's talking about these mother onions, he's saying that it's not normal to bring in these mother onions at all. You're only taking out the seed. And in that way, it's treated like two different species, so that these mother onions, according to Rabbi Yossi, would not be subject, and because you're not bringing it in for storage. If you were bringing it in for storage, then it would be subject. But he's saying that that's not the normal way. It's not even almost edible. So in the other cases where you're planting the seeds or the sets or the scallion type things or the ones from last year, you're going to wait for them to grow and to split, and you are going to go gather them all in and collect them, either to store or to sell to market. But the mother onion of it being used specifically for seed, that's where the difference is. So I want to just read a note here by the Shara Muna from page 185. And it says, this reason too is needed only according to Shmuel, for as stated above, Rav maintains that Rabbi Yossi exempts mother onions because they are barely edible. And Rav disagrees with the Bryce's understanding of the dispute between Rabbi Yossi and the sages. Although Rav was an Amorah, he had the authority to disagree with the Tanaim. So that's going to wrap it up for chapter 3, Halacha 3 of Peah. Tomorrow we're going to get into chapter 3, Halacha 4 of Peah. Thank you so much.